Welcome, everyone. This is a fantastic turnout. I'm so glad you're here today. A special welcome to those who are on live stream, joining us online. Boy, it got quiet. I didn't hear if someone was commenting to me. Okay. We're very pleased to have Tim Hart-Andersen opening up our program year once again. I know he's got lots to say, and everybody's interested in hearing what he has to say. So why don't we start with a prayer, Margaret?
Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, we thank you for this day and for this time together. We thank you for your church, through which we know each other and know you. We thank you for the call to love and to serve you, and for the saints who serve and have served here. We're especially grateful today for the ministry of Tim Hart-Andersen. We ask your blessing on this time as we look back together and with appreciation and celebration of all that this congregation has done together in service to you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So welcome to Third Age. This has got to be a record turnout. Our tradition every year is for Tim to introduce the program year to kick us off, and this year especially we were hoping that Tim would agree to join us for a retrospective on his service at Westminster. For those who are new to Third Age is a program designed to create a place of belonging for adults at Westminster to come together and thrive spiritually and relationally and emotionally and physically. And so we offer a wide variety of programming which the Third Age Committee has put together. So please, we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end, what's ahead, but please mark your calendar for this. This is one of my favorite ministry areas at Westminster that I get to support, and I love seeing such a big group here coming together, and those of us who are joining us online as well. It is usually our custom for one of the Third Age Committee members to introduce our guest, but this time Sue asked me to introduce Tim to you, which seems a little silly because Tim really needs no introduction here. So I was thinking about how to do that, and only this morning it occurred to me that I might ask Rodney for some help. Rodney, who is our gallerist and archivist, I thought maybe he has something from when Tim was first introduced to this congregation, from when Tim came on staff. So Tim, I know that you don't like surprises, but this isn't too big of a surprise. It's published printed material. This is the brochure that was sent around to the congregation when Tim came here. And there are the names, the search committee who brought Tim to us. It has a note from the Reverend Dan Little about Tim. Dan knew of Tim. It has a note about Tim's family, about Beth and Nate and Izzy. And then it's got a laundry list of Tim's accomplishments prior to coming to Westminster. His D-Min, which he was in the process of getting when he came here, his MDiv degree from McCormick, his undergraduate degree, and then his experience as head of staff at Old First Church in San Francisco and associate executive presbyter in the Presbytery of Los Ranchos in California. And then it has some words from Tim himself. Tim talks about preaching as one of his greatest joys of ministry, forcing him to take seriously the Word of God in his own life. He talks about leadership. A good leader is one who knows how to discern direction and develop a vision. I see that we've got more folks coming in, and I just love that. I think looks like Eric's helping with chairs, so we'll continue to get folks settled. So Tim talks about preaching, he talks about leadership, and then he shares his thoughts about Westminster. And Tim, I'm going to read what you said about Westminster when you were coming here 25 years ago. He wrote this: "The next pastor of Westminster will be in a key position to provide leadership in the Twin Cities to help create an urban environment where justice and compassion prevail and where the future holds promise for all. And the Presbyterian Church needs Westminster to demonstrate what the church can do and who the church can be in the city. A lively place of worship, a welcoming and serving community, a beacon of hope, in short, a telling presence. Tim said, "I am eager to join Westminster as together with energy and imagination, we live into an exciting future, trusting God to lead the way." Tim, I think you lived into what was then your future with such purpose and promise. I am so grateful to you for being here to talk about what that ministry was like here at Westminster. So Tim, thank you. Welcome.
Oh, my goodness. I had a mustache in that photo. I look at that and I think, you called me? Thank you, Margaret, for a very generous introduction, and thank you all for being here. Some of you, I think, probably most of you, have had the experience of retiring or thinking about retirement. It's a weird deal. One moment you're fully engaged doing something, and the next moment you're not. And that moment's coming soon for me. I have things that I will engage in, but it won't be this. So that's an abrupt transition for me, and it's challenging. But this exercise, which I was asked to do, thank you very much for the invitation to do a retrospective, it helped me, frankly, quite a bit just to think back on what's happened here, who we've been, what we've done together, and what we can all give thanks for. So let's start at where we started. The next slide, I want to talk about the two contexts that we were each in. I had my context, we had ours, and you had yours. How many of you were actually members of the church in '99? Okay, that's like about maybe half of you. Let me just bring you up to speed if you weren't here in '99. Some of you will know this context better than I, but this was a church that had just lost its pastor rather abruptly. They had a staff, and an associate pastor fell in love, and they resigned, and they divorced their spouses and ended up marrying and are still happily married. But it was an abrupt and difficult change. It involved sexual misconduct charges that were not brought against them, but they were self-accused, I guess is the technical language. And so the church was reeling from that. And then it was 2 years. That happened at the end of September of '97. 2 years later was when I arrived, started October 1st, '99. So I begin my 25th year in just a couple weeks. Those of you who were here remember that Dan Little, referenced in my brochure introducing me, was here as he never adopted the title interim pastor, but that's what he was in effect, helping the church first deal with the stuff that comes from a difficult transition that you all went through, and then next to help the church begin to turn its direction to the future. And I knew Dan for many years and was serving on the board of McCormick Seminary in Chicago, my alma mater, Beth's alma mater, my dad's alma mater, my father-in-law's alma mater, my brother-in-law's. We are McCormick people, all right? And Dan was a McCormick person, and he and I talked for some reason every time I went to a board meeting in that year, 97, 98, I found myself assigned to a room with Dan Little. And he would keep me up late talking about what was going on at Westminster, and finally began talking to me about Westminster. And he's the one who suggested to me that I consider Westminster, and Westminster heard from Dan that they ought to consider me. Because I was not an obvious candidate. So my context, our context, we were living in San Francisco. I was pastor of Old First Church. the oldest Protestant church in California, started in 1849 in the Gold Rush on Van Ness at Sacramento, if you know the city. And we had been there for a decade, the decade of the AIDS crisis in San Francisco and lots of other things going on. Very much an urban city, a church right at the base of Nob Hill. And it was by the time I left, it was about a 310-member church. So considerably smaller than this. We did have one associate for a couple of years, and then she moved on. So it was basically THA and a few other staff members engaged in a pretty exciting ministry. That was my first congregation that I'd served. So a committee in this church would not typically look at someone who's in their first call at a church of 300 without a complex staff. So it was Dan Little that, and I wouldn't have looked at a church like this either, for that matter. It was Dan Little that bridged the gap. So basically we're here today because of Dan Little. And those of you who know Dan and remember Dan, he's just a wonderful, wonderful human being. So the call emerged from conversations that began in December of '98. The first time I met anyone from Westminster was at an interview that really wasn't an interview. They kept saying, this is not really an interview, this is a visit. Are there any people from the PNC here today? I can't quite see who's, no, okay. They insisted it wasn't an interview. This is just a visit. You've never been to Minneapolis. So we flew to Minneapolis. It was a week before Christmas. And, I was in the middle of Christmas season at the church there, so it was a little hard to get away. It was 3 days, and it was in the 50s. And they kept saying, this is pretty much what winter's like here. I knew better. I spent a lifetime of winters in Chicago, so I knew what to expect. I love winter anyway. So that encounter in December of '98 was our first and only encounter, and it was not an interview. And the next thing I know, fast forward to June of '99, out of the blue comes a phone call from David Kohler saying that I was their choice. And they wanted me to come actually now have an interview. Beth, you mind my telling you your reaction to that? She was really angry about that. The reason why was that we had not heard from the committee. We hadn't had a formal interview. We hadn't had anything that you would expect from a search process. And suddenly out of the blue, this bolt, we want you to come, you're our finalist. And Beth made it clear that I guess it was they didn't appreciate the way her husband was treated, or at least as she perceived the treatment of her husband. And David Kohler wrote about a 10-page letter describing why that happened like that. We came, Beth said, she knew from the December visit we were going to end up here. She was right. So we moved our 3 kids. There were 7, 9, and 11. They're now 31, 33, and 35. It was interesting to hear how we asked how they wanted to be described. And then that brochure, Madeline described herself, I think, as a violin. She loves the violin. And Nate liked baseball, and Izzy had a rat named Jack. A rat named Jack. So, a rat named Jack. Her grandfather's name was Jack. So, yeah, they were, it was a hard transition for them, but we arrived. Beth arrived with the kids in August, and I didn't get here until the end of September. I had to wrap up some things in September, so I drove across the U.S. with that rat named Jack. Interesting experience. We went to every national park so we could stand by the sign with the rat named Jack. Well-traveled rat. And when I got here, I was still working on finishing my doctoral dissertation, and so my first day of work was October 1, '99, in the 49th floor of IDS. There was a vacant office. Jim Peter, who was on the committee, was managing that floor, and he got me a room with a view so I could look down at Westminster as I finished working on my doctoral thesis, which was entitled Communities of Resilience, Sustainable Urban Congregations, which is, and I just part of this exercise in thinking about retrospective. What has happened is a lot of what I wrote there about what a congregation it's going to be sustainable and resilient wants to pursue, or how you reach that. So that's how I spent my first month on the job, finishing the thesis and looking down at Westminster, wondering what in the world I got myself into. We arrived, and there's a term in ministry called the after pastor, which is, there's a whole literature about it, a pastor who follows a departure that was difficult for one reason or another, usually sexual misconduct, sometimes financial shenanigans or whatever it might be. And so I came expecting that there'd be a lot of stuff that I'd have to focus on in my first months and perhaps years here, and was relieved to find that the congregation really was ready to move on, and in large respect had moved on, thanks to Dan Little's good work, and frankly, the way you all openly process this. So often in the congregations, something like this is tamped down and not talked about and becomes a secret that erodes the life of the community. That did not happen here. I was really grateful for that. So I did not find myself having to deal with a lot of that kind of fallout, betrayal or whatever. I found the congregation ready to go, and one of the first things we did was a change in music staff happened, and then what I'm saying is the music staff who was going to be leading us on the organ and the choir was settled. Did I see Melanie here in the room someplace? No? Okay, all right. So we made some transition and settled our music staff, and just to point out the relationship between the preacher and the music staff is really critical in a church. It's in some ways the most important relationship, and I had not had a very good one in San Francisco. I wanted a good one here, and it's been stellar the whole time I've been here because of the individuals who have held those positions. So we came in next slide please, Keith, in 2000, and there was a capital campaign already underway that you all had done during the transition, during the time between the times, during the interim. You remember this was the sanctuary remodel, and you were going to build a new education wing, and you put that on hold until the new minister got here. So I got here, and we needed to raise some more money because it'd been a couple years and costs had escalated. And I also said, how much did you give to mission in the first campaign? And the answer was, oh, well, nothing. So I was shocked, and I don't mean to be negative about anybody in leadership then, but probably hadn't thought about it, and the needs in the building were really significant. So we added on a little mini campaign, and instead of a tithe, which is kind of what I think is a minimum, 10% of whatever you raise to mission, I said, let's do a double tithe to kind of catch up a bit. That's where the notion of a double tithe, 20% of a capital campaign going to mission, came from. And we raised enough money to build that education wing. I was asked, did I want to make any changes in the plans, and I did. I suggested that we build that in a way that we could go up, so we can add 2 floors on that wing if you all want to do that sometime in the future. And there was carpet in the plan through the whole area all the way down to the door, and I said, let's do that in slate. And then where the Bushnell room is now is not where it was in the plan. It was over in what is now the gallery. And I thought it would be nicer to kind of have a space to gather, so that I couldn't believe how accommodating everybody was and ready to support these changes. So it was the first instance I had where I was beginning to discover that as a pastor here, you have a fair amount of influence on what goes on He's like, okay, I'll do that. What do you do with a double tithe of $600,000 for mission? Well, you put together a committee and you discern the Spirit of God where God would have us put those dollars, and affordable housing emerged as the theme of what we wanted to do. And that began then in that little mini campaign, and since then now we have built, or are in the process of building, or soon will build with other partners in the community, about 350 units of housing through campaigns and through our work with Habitat, et cetera. And our global partnerships began in that early period. Dan had started one with Brazil, and I traveled there with Westminster people. That kind of fizzled out because the partner fizzled out. It was a seminary that was a shoestring budget, and the shoestring went away. But we visited early on in Cuba, 2001, and then Cameroon, and then Israel, Palestine. So the global partnerships began early on in my time here. Let's go to the next slide. We began expanding the staff a little bit, added some, for the first time, a minister focused on mission and justice, and that was the Reverend Mitchell back there. I put the word justice in here because Doug came in and said, yeah, I'll be the faith in action associate pastor, but we're going to talk about justice, and we're going to learn about it. Kathy and Michael is forever saying, justice changed my life. Doug, you changed my life. I think about my faith completely differently. And that's true for many of us, Doug. Thank you for that. We had a worship visioning process, mostly because I wanted to change some things, but I didn't just want to do it by fiat. I wanted us to discern what I hoped would happen, and it did happen. We learned that we have people who want a whole bunch of different styles of worship, and not just the traditional 11 o'clock or 10:30 because of the Vikings game. I know that was changed. Not just the traditional Westminster service where everything's done decently and in order. There are those who want some movement of the Spirit, somebody to say, God is good all the time. Yes, they wanted to loosen up a bit. Some did. And some wanted a more quiet, contemplative experience of worship. I certainly did myself. So out of this worship visioning process, we began to think of different ways and different spaces that we would need to host those different ways of worship. And that began early on in my ministry. We celebrated our sesquicentennial 150th anniversary in 2007, which brought us into the second capital campaign we've done together. And we published this outstanding history, the fourth published printed history of Westminster, which it tells the story of the church, the history of the church in a very different way from the other three histories. It's a bunch of vignettes about individuals, some of whom are well-known and prominent, some of whom are wonderful people whom we've heard of perhaps, but the rest of the community might not have. So if you haven't looked at it or read it, it's a great way to tell the story of Westminster. In that campaign, we renewed the 12th Street side of the building. We renovated the chapel, put a new organ in there. We were tuck pointing the foundation along 12th Street, and I said, you mean we're going to excavate all the basement wall? And they said, yes. I said, well, let's put some rooms down there. So we put rooms in there. That's where some of the rooms that we use now for the archive and the Thompson room emerged from that project as well. We divided the $15 million that was raised there three ways. $6 million was on the building, $6 million went into the endowment, which needed to be boosted, in my view, in terms of providing long-term sustainable support. And then double tithe, the $3 million to mission. Again, it was focused on affordable housing and a major commitment to global ministry as well. Then we go to the next chapter of my experience here at Westminster. We, in 2012, very suddenly and surprisingly came into ownership of the adjacent half block through some rather remarkable, one might even say miraculous, responses to opportunity. And we acquired it, and then rather than rush into it, we knew we needed it for parking. Our parking has been an issue for this church for a long time, and as an urban pastor, I know the number one impediment for people participating is access. They can't access the building. And you know that our parking during the week was virtually nil. We had 25 staff members probably using the 25 stalls we owned. Where did you all park today? If you drove, you probably parked in the garage. Before our campaign, you would not have been able to do that because there were buildings here that had access to that parking. It was not ours except on Saturdays, Sundays, and in the evenings. So parking was the initial drive for acquiring this property, and then we stopped and said, let's think very carefully what the Spirit would have us do with this land. And so we had the strategic planning process that James Dayton designed. Jim Dayton put it together and ran it. It was very helpful. We listened a lot, and many of you were involved in that listening and discernment, and we emerged with a bold plan. We didn't know how bold it was at the time. We thought from early estimates we might need about 35 million or so to do this. And it turned out that was about half of what was needed eventually. Actually, not even half, but our early estimates were just sort of back of the napkin. Well, it probably cost $3 million to put in the parking. Well, it was $15 million to put in the parking. Probably cost $100,000 to take the buildings down. That was $5 million. I mean, so we, with faith and trust, we set forward on this journey, not really knowing what in the world we'd gotten ourselves into. And you know, we managed to do it. Here we are in this space. The live stream, many of you think maybe that the live stream just came into our life during the pandemic. No, it was 10 years before the pandemic we were live streaming. And that was is a little Westminster story. After a memorial service, a long-time, wonderful member of the church came up to me and said, "That was a lovely service. I really couldn't hear a word, but it was lovely." And then they said, "Please come see me about what I can do to help improve the sound. And get a proposal and bring it to me." So we got a proposal, and the company, the vendor, said that we can improve the sound, and here's how, but as long as we're doing that, why don't we put in what's called live stream capacity? And it was double the cost of just the improvement for sound. And I went and visited the church member and said, here's what it will cost for improving the sound, so next memorial service you can hear, or Sunday morning service for that matter. And then there's this idea of another gift to put in the live stream, and they said, I have no idea what that is, but if you think we should do it, let's do it. So we did it, and within a year, that person was ill and could not come to church and was confined to bed. And guess how she went to church? Live streamed, yeah. So they learned what live stream is useful for. When you can't come to church, you can go to church anyway. And that was 10 years before the pandemic. So we were fully engaged in streaming our services, but nothing else. That would come later. We also, early on in this period, actually before we launched the capital campaign, developed a relationship with Grace Trinity in Uptown, which was about to close. They were voting to close it, and we thought Uptown ought to have a a thriving Presbyterian church in it, or it's actually Presbyterian and Baptist. And their church council agreed to work with us, and it became, in researching the history of the church, it became the 16th church that we've started in our history. It was a restart, and as with almost every one of these, a restart with other people engaged. And there were a handful, maybe 20 or 25 members there who held on, and we together restarted that church, and it's thriving now. They just completed a $2.5 million capital campaign and have changed their facility considerably, and they're a strong congregation searching for a new pastor. Dan Vigilante was there for 10 years and then headed out to a church in Pennsylvania. So all of this came to a head, and we needed to fund a lot of costs that were beginning to come out of the strategic planning process in terms of imagining space like this and outdoor space like we have. The parking was key all along, and of course our commitment to mission. Originally we had imagined it would be $7 million for mission because we thought it was a $35 million building project. It turned out to be all in about $80 million, and so we have done $8 million for mission, a tithe off of that. And this new wing and parking, all of that was built from 2016 to 2018. And just to be honest, we didn't really know what to do with it all once it opened. It was right before the Super Bowl in 2018. Some of you will remember the Super Bowl coming to Minneapolis, a big deal. And we had kind of a counter event here. I forget, Super Bowl of Hope, I think we called it, and raised several $100,000 for alleviating hunger in the city, and had some football stars and others come. And that was the first time we used this room for a big public event. The first meeting we had in the building when we opened in 2018 was a trustee meeting. The trustees used to meet in the Minneapolis Club. And I remember one trustee telling me, it was Hart-Andersen, former clerk of session who attends the trustee meetings. He showed up one Monday for the trustee meeting and went to the room where we've been meeting, and they said, "Oh, we've moved the Westminster trustees to another room." And he said, "Well, you can't do that. We've been using this room since Roosevelt was president." Teddy Roosevelt. So anyway, we to my surprise, trustees, some of whom were in leadership in the campaign, when this building opened, they said, "We don't have to meet at the Minneapolis Club anymore. We've got the parking, we've got great space, and we've got a kitchen. So let's have them." So we shifted our meetings onto the site here, which I think was a good thing to have done. But we didn't know how to run a parking garage. We didn't know how to generate revenue from the parking garage. We didn't really know about how to manage events. We didn't have anybody on staff to coordinate all of that. And so that first year, 2018, we were running to catch up, I would say, throughout the year on the facility, figuring it out. And it took us that whole year before we kind of figured it out. And then by 2019, we were at least approaching cruising altitude and using this space and seeing it as a wonderful way to serve the community and the church and to find the right balance of that. It was due to a lot of lay leadership and staff leaders that we began to figure out how to be a church with this kind of a facility. Very different. Some of you remember the old facility. Just think of the restrooms in the old facility, specifically the women's restroom. I mean the line out the door of the marble mausoleum with 3 very narrow stalls in it and those big pillars in the, it's hard to remember how the building was and how well we did what we did in that facility. But so we figured that out over the course of 2019, and then of course we got to 2020. And 2020, like everybody else in the nation and in the world, we entered into the pandemic pivot, which meant immediately shutting down. The session was called an emergency meeting on Friday, I think it was the 13th, interestingly enough, March 13th, and they said they voted to suspend worship for 2 weeks. And just before we ended the meeting, I said, maybe we should empower the clerk and the moderator to extend that if we find we need to extend it so we don't have to meet again. We were meeting in person in the room here, or not, probably, no, it was the Meisel room. Anyway, we did need to extend it, and that was Friday evening, so we had to notify everybody that we weren't going to church in person, we were going to go to church online. This room became a studio, and it was over here was the preaching studio set, over there was a musician's set, and our tech team was awesome, and we all wore masks and sat way apart from one another, and there were probably 8 of us in the space, figuring out how to do worship in this space and deliver a meaningful experience online of the worship of God. It was a challenge, I think, in every respect. How do you preach to a camera? How do you pray to a camera? How do you serve communion? How do you have an ordination service? How do you, on and on and on. We had the team really pivoted well. The tech team, the musicians, the ministers, and we really didn't miss a beat in our worship experience, except we weren't together. And that extended for a long time. We put together a COVID response group, building safety group, and they met for 2 years advising us, and we had a lot of different protocols that we put out through our website, through emails, and I want to say that I hear from other pastors or read about it, the terrible split that happened over this and requirements, pushback, anger. We had none of that here. None of it. Occasionally someone would say, well, in our job we're doing this, and we'd listen and learn from that. But there was no pushback. And when we were done, it didn't occur to me while we were going through this, but thinking back on it, that's remarkable, because it was a huge change in how we were being the church. And people adjusted. The flexibility and the resilience of the community was quite evident in how everyone responded. We, of course, experienced in our city the terrible police murder of George Floyd at 38th in Chicago, which is just not probably 2 miles south of us here. And you remember the uprising that happened in the city right after that, and you remember the National Guard being deployed to Minneapolis. They were actually billeted across the street at the Hyatt, so we were right in the middle of a deployment of troops. I remember Pentecost Sunday. We were told by the police that vigilante groups were seeking to firebomb churches who had expressed support for more racial justice in the community, and our sign expressed that. So the biggest threats came on Saturday before Pentecost of 2020. So I spent the night here. Yeah. I spent the night with PJ, walking the perimeter. There were no firebombs. But if you know the story of Pentecost, there's fire on Pentecost. And so I was exhausted, but I flailed away on the set in here and made it through. Did better than I'm doing now. But we spent most of the night out front on the steps just to keep watch all over the whole property. And the military was all over the place, up and down. There were marchers and others up and down, and a memorable evening, a Pentecost evening. we also, in this time, learned that we could do other things online in addition to worship. We began live streaming educational programs. Matt Skinner had just come on our staff in January to do this wonderful engagement opportunity we had, and lo and behold, it turned out we couldn't do any of that, so he pivoted and produced a wonderful series of video interviews with theologians across the country and kind of on the signs of the times. And so we had strong adult education. Our children, youth, and families pivoted to church school online. We even had occasional, when we could do it, music events online. Everything was, we kept the church going. So we had this great learning experience, and came out of it, and let's go to where we are. At the end of it, we were, by the end of the pandemic, we were at the end of our capital campaign that had built this facility. We were using it, but we had a large debt, which we all knew. The congregation actually had to vote to take on the financing to build this out. And the congregation did, and the congregation stepped up and responded very generously in that campaign. The project cost was just over 80. We raised about 65 million, which meant we had about a $20 million debt that was growing all the time because debts have interest. And we borrowed from Thrivent and the Presbyterian groups, and I think you all know we've paid off Thrivent more than a year early, and if all goes well, we'll pay off the Presbyterian debt a lot sooner than they expect in the 20 years. Maybe we'll see how we do, but the signs are really positive in that campaign. We announced a $30 million goal. It turns out we've had such good returns, so to speak, early payments on pledges that the amount is shifting downward that we need because the interest is shifting downward, and I want to thank you all for your support of that. We'll have a celebration next month, wherever we are, to kind of say we've done what we can do, and maybe there's a little bit more to do, but it's going really, really well. And that gets us to 2023, where we are now. We will conclude the Enduring Hope campaign this fall before I leave. The counseling center, which was on pause, reopens this fall, we hope. About to launch a search for a new executive director. Margaret retired, and we felt it right to just stop and say, how can we do this in a very sustainable way, and took time to figure that out and supported it in the campaign as part of the mission component. And I should have said a word about that. We put in our mission component in this campaign, we are releasing more than $2 million basically into the community, but a few other partners elsewhere globally and across the country, but mostly into the community, which is a wonderful thing to be able to do. We're hosting a national stewardship conference next month called Kaleidoscope. It's a Presbyterian Church annual event that there'll be hundreds of people. This is something we can do here now. And denomination loves to come to Westminster because, you know, if it's winter, they can walk through the Skyway to get into our building, and they can park here, et cetera. And I'm supposed to speak about capital campaigns. And the title of my presentation is Capital Campaigning for Good. And maybe it's, I'll tell you a little secret about why I love to do capital campaigns, because it energizes the congregation for whatever the principal ostensible reason is, but it also allows you to put a lot more funding into mission, into the city, into the global needs that we have. We have increased what we could do in mission many millions of dollars because we had these campaigns, each one with a mission component, which I'm really grateful to think about what we've been able to do in working in these campaigns to support important initiatives in the city and beyond. So then you've got the senior pastor transitioning, and that's happening like 6 weeks from now or something. October 31st is my last day. My last sermon is the 29th, and you know we're in the 7 last words. And I've delivered the first. And I'm conceiving of this time, September, October, for me and for us as a long extended benediction of gratitude. So I got to finishing all this, and I thought, well, let's look at the numbers. That is just a way to think about what the church was like 24 plus years ago and what it's like today. Our membership back then in 99 was 1,700. It was 1,750 or 60 or 40, something like that. 2,700. We grew, but not that much. So that's a correction. I stand corrected. 2,750 or something like that when I came, and it's now about 3,100 members. This is a result of the dynamism of this community, the thriving nature of who you all are, in a context and a culture that was working in the opposite direction. I think I've preached around almost 1,000 sermons, and I look at that and I go, holy cow, what else can I say? Well, I've got 6 Sundays to figure that out. 960 is what I just projected. It's roughly 40 times a year I have preached. 250 memorial services is just, again, an estimate, and Janice, my colleague with whom I work very closely and who prepares for these services with me, said, oh no, you did more than that. So I thought it was closer to 300, but a lot of memorial services, especially in recent years. I think I got away with doing only about 50 weddings. Ministers will tell you they prefer memorial services to weddings because we're just the florist and the photographer and the minister and the caterer, but in a memorial service they're coming to hear hope and good news. So maybe I did more than 50, but we don't do that many weddings. We might do 20 to 30 a year now. It used to be many more, and we're doing probably maybe at least a third of them not on site elsewhere these days. I think I've led 200 forums, town hall forums, led one yesterday. I have one more to go with Steve Inskeep on October 7th. That was one of the things that attracted me when I looked at the position description all those years ago. The idea that I could sit with really interesting people and get to know them and listen to them and engage them in conversation was very attractive to me. And it's been one of the most fascinating parts of my job. On this October 7th forum, there's going to be music beforehand, Monroe Crossing, who's playing the next day at worship. But we're also going to I'm going to do a retrospective of forum leadership for 30 minutes or so just before that forum, and just reflect on the voices I've heard, the people I've met, the scenes I have seen in my office, like the guy who stood on his head. Would you mind if I stood on my head before I went out there? Go right ahead, and he did for 5 minutes. He was from San Francisco. So was I. So then in terms of the annual budgets over these years, I think we've probably grown from a million plus to now a little over 5. And roughly estimating around 70 million has been put to good work by our session and the trustees over these years. In capital campaigns, assuming we go well with the Enduring Hope campaign, we will have together raised more than $100 million over these years and put that to good use in various ways, including in mission. Part of that 108 is, you figure it's about 10-15% of it has gone to mission. And the mission funding over these years, I put 23 million, that's through capital campaign mission support and annual mission support, which is strong. And we're a mission supporting congregation. And that means we're engaged in the city in lots of ways, and the funding is important as a way for us to bring something into a partnership and listen where funding can be constructively applied. The endowment when I got here was a little under 10. I remember when we hit 15 million, Sam Cook and I said, let's double that if we can, and it doubled, and we actually peaked, I think, at about 33 or 34, and now have settled back down to just over 30 million. I don't know what the current number is, but it's around that. And that is really a key way that we create sustainability in the church, because it provides stability, it provides resources over the long term, it gives us capacity to be flexible, to fall back on resources if we need them. I'm glad that our annual budget receives support, but not a whole lot, about 15 to 17% from our endowment. Mostly it's a pay-as-you-go operation. People are committed, and they make their commitments, and we put those to good work. So, and as I've sort of thought about all of this, what are the themes that I have, I guess, lived by in my ministry here with you, and I think we've lived together by? First, go to the next slide, Keith. These are all verbs. Be generous. Be generous. And we know that God so loved the world that God was generous to the world. So you know that I've never been one to let the church protect itself from its own generosity. You'll hear that probably one more time before we finish, but be generous. That's what Christians do. It's who we are. Enjoy life together. I forget what moment it was. I think after the election of me as your pastor in early August of '99, I was supposed to say something, and I thought, oh my gosh, I hadn't thought about what to say. And I said, let's enjoy this. And we have. Build partnerships. Ministry is not a solo pursuit. It's not a kind of Lone Ranger. It's not an individualistic pursuit. Build partnerships. Everything we do, whether it's working with the children or budgeting processes or planning worship or welcoming community or thinking about new members or showing hospitality, all of that is about sustaining the church. I'm not one to buy into the church is in decline thing. There are numbers that would indicate that the church in 15 or 20 years might not exist. I'm not there because the church isn't ours, it's God's. So it's our role to do everything we can to sustain the church. And finally, give thanks. So, thank you. Bottom line, last slide. It's driven my ministry. Isn't that a fun picture? It's missing you, Margaret, but yeah, we could Photoshop you in, but the bottom line about my ministry, and I think it's true of this church, is we're called to worship and serve. And worship is another way of saying love God, and serve is another way to say love neighbor. So it's been great loving God and loving neighbor with you all these years. Thank you.
Tim, we are going to ask if you would answer some questions. We have about 15 minutes for questions if you all have them, or comments. I think we would allow comments in this case.
And by the way, I might add, if I made a mistake or something, just let me know, correct me. I've already caught one. Dwayne, I see Dwayne has a question.
Tim, thank you very much. Before you started seminary, you were in graduate school in Texas, studying, as I recall, hearing about it, studying Latin American history and politics, and you spent time in Latin America doing research or just learning more about it, and you obviously know Spanish, which has been a great thing. How has that experience affected your ministry and your theology?
Okay, thanks for that question, Dwayne. Gracias por esa pregunta. Muy interesante. I do have a master's degree in Latin American Studies from University of Texas, Austin, which is one of the leading schools in that field in the nation. I was in a doctoral program in anthropology and left that and didn't complete it. My area of specialty was the Andean region. Oh, thank you very much. The Andean region, that is Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, their history, their pre-Inca history. Spent a lot of time in those countries. I've been to Mexico maybe 15 times, and actually went Cuba was in seminary. My first trip to Cuba was in 1982. So I brought with me ability to speak Spanish, which I've used in my ministry everywhere I've been. My first call was in Southern California as an associate presbytery executive, and one of my roles was to work with the 7 or 8 Hispanic congregations that worshiped in Spanish, and when their ministers left, I would go and preach and moderate the session meetings. So, in San Francisco, the same thing. They were in the Mission District before it was overrun by tech, as it has been. It was a Latin American community, and I worked closely with the Presbyterian Church there. So everywhere I've been in my ministry, including here, I've used my Spanish, so it's been, just in terms of the language, it's been quite helpful. The theologies that emerged from Latin America and starting in the late 60s in conference in Puebla, Mexico, and then in Colombia and other parts of Latin America became known as theologies of liberation. By the time I got to seminary in 1980, those theologies were being taught, at least at my seminary, McCormick, and that shaped, I guess I would say, it shaped my own understanding of what God is up to in the world. And I guess I would say the nub of that theology is that God is very much aligned with the poor. And the church should likewise be there. Good question, Dwayne.
I got you, Ann.
Yep.
I don't really have a question, excuse me, but I do have a compliment. As a longtime ecumenist, the ecumenical service that you put on for your installation was probably the best I've ever seen. And knowing that Manly had been moderator of the presbytery, I've been to a lot of them. I hope the church continues that, because that's a wonderful thing. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks. The reference Anna's making to the installation service in November of 1999, let's see, we had Father Michael O'Connell from the Basilica spoke, and Rabbi Joseph Edelheit spoke. Our daughter Isabel fell asleep in the pew, and he commented about that. There she is. Yeah, and we also had a group of dancers from San Francisco. The church I left came and danced to a couple pieces. Afterwards, I heard a few things like, "Are we going to have dance now all the time?" We have had dance, and this is a great place for all kinds of type of dancing. So thank you for that comment. You know, the other worship service, I really feel, as I look back, that it's not here, but the General Assembly worship service in 2010, Westminster had a lot to do with that opening service. and it was wild. We had a Heart of the Beast marching puppets in the convention center down the aisle, and that the song we sang last Sunday about all those creation, oh sister moon and brother, all that was what we sang there, and all creation came in, and with thousands of Presbyterians. Oh, it was just awesome. I loved that. I love putting together worship. I'm going to miss that. Other comments or questions? And then Wendy has one too after Manley.
Tim, you said your research for your doctorate was on resilience in congregations. What did you learn in that has been very helpful? Are there some things that you learned in your study that have proved to be useful at Westminster?
Oh, yeah. One is it's a congregation that's going to be sustainable was best operating under the theology of abundance as opposed to scarcity, which we have done here. A congregation leadership and membership needs to be as diverse as possible. Back when I was writing that, there was a thing called the Church Growth Movement, and their fundamental tenet was create communities of like-minded people. Couples who have 2.5 children and are between the ages of 30 and 35 and will grow fast, and that is true. It happened that, and a lot of churches started that way and grew to thousands of members, but they're not sustainable communities. A diverse community, I was using an ecosystem as a metaphor for what a sustainable congregation would be like. And a sustainable ecosystem is a diverse ecosystem. It's diverse. It's not a monoculture. It knows its carrying capacity. It knows its resources. A congregation, similarly, will thrive if it's diverse, if it understands its capacities, and is adaptive to its environment. Resilience arises from that. So yes, those principles in my thesis have been very much at the core of what we tried to do here. And I'm happy to share my thesis with you. As far as I know, only one person has read it. My mom.
Tim?
Okay, Wendy, and then another question back there,
I'm
looks like.
jumping in first. Hearing the bells, no, it's me back
Oh, over here, Sue, okay.
Hearing the bells made me realize you didn't mention the bells coming in.
I didn't mention the bells. I knew I wouldn't have to. Yeah, we have bells. And that was Jim Dayton's kind of crowning vision for this building, that it would embody visually, because he wanted them exposed, so it's like art, and orally through the ears, it would embody the telling presence. He was driven by how do we expand the telling presence as much as we can. That's why we're clear glass windows. We can see out, people can see in. That's why we're hearing these bells, and the city is hearing these bells. We're here, and we're not going anywhere. So, yeah, the bells were an important part of the finishing of this building, and a statement about this church's presence, I think, in the community. Now, where was it, Wendy?
Yeah, I'm right here. Being one of the 50 that you married, I think it's important to share with you that when I talk about my wedding with people, I tell them that I don't remember the cake and the party and the music. I remember the service. It was, that's the part that was important to me. But I'm curious if you have, during the church year, a favorite Sunday, and if you'd share with us a favorite hymn of yours.
Okay, good question. Do I have a favorite Sunday in a church year? I had to move out because the sound, it goes that way, and I'm behind the speakers. On Sunday morning, I use a little listening device up front so I can hear the wonderful prayers or other things happening. Well, having just had coming together, that was pretty awesome. Yeah, great energy in the room on Sunday. In terms of preaching, I really like Reformation Sunday. I like Trinity Sunday, believe it or not, which is one that often preachers try to ignore, because who can explain the Trinity? I love Pentecost. Easter's great, but it probably would not be among the Sundays I really appreciate. I would say Reformation Sunday and Trinity Sunday. I also like Baptism of the Lord Sunday when we remember our baptisms. Be interested to ask all of you that question.
I thought it was Transfiguration, Tim. No. I thought it was Transfiguration. Yeah, when I asked ChatGPT to write a Transfiguration sermon in the style of Tim Hart-Andersen, it couldn't do it because it had nothing to work from.
This is a running joke among the clergy. I will have gone through 24 Transfiguration Sundays and never preached a one of them. And Margaret had to preach it because she was the new one in the house. So, yeah.
Do you have a charge for us on how to care and support the rest of the ministerial staff during the transition?
Well, isn't that a good question? I'm not sure that I have any wisdom other than just keep doing what you're doing. Know that your pastors here, and frankly other members of the staff, but particularly the pastors, are going to have extra things on their platters during the time of transition. Weird things can happen in a church when a longtime minister leaves, and when you hear those weird things, don't go that direction, or do what you can to undo the weirdness. Know that your ministers are doing everything they can to keep this ship moving forward, and we have a terrific ministerial staff here, and count on them to provide good leadership and support them as they offer that leadership. I would say that Megan will be the acting head of staff when we get to November 1, and she particularly is going to be needing support as she leads the staff and provides kind of the overall direction until we have a transitional pastor sometime after the first of the year. I keep saying we have, you have. So yeah, I would. There are wonderful leaders, our ministers on our staff, as are the musicians and everybody else. It's a great staff team. Count on them to provide good leadership and trust that that's what they're doing the best they can, and support them. They may not be doing everything that you think they could do or ought to do, but I do a lot, and all of a sudden, no one's going to be here doing all of that. And we've, of course, planned parsing it out, and much of it falls to Megan. And she's obviously willing and capable to take that on, but yeah. I just want to note that, I think most of you know this, but when a minister retires, they step aside from everything. So who was it that was telling me this story about, the minister was, the Sunday before their retirement, had someone come up to him and said, I really had hoped you would do my memorial service, and I'm glad you're retiring, and it's wonderful that you're heading off into the next chapter of your life, and I'm sorry you won't do my service, understanding that wouldn't happen. He retired, the next Sunday was his last service. He did that person's service on Saturday. So she died in the week. Don't anybody worry about that. There are a lot of good ministers who can do your memorial services, but I won't be able to do them, or the weddings of your children or grandchildren, or of you maybe, but there are terrific ministers on our staff who can do all of those pastoral responsibilities and do them very well.
Tim, I'm just wondering, how many more questions do you have time for? I want to make sure we honor your time here.
I shouldn't say this, but I have a lot of time.
Awesome. We're gonna keep going. All right. I've got Betty, and then we'll make our way around.
Yeah, Betty.
Hello there. You know that it was about 10 years ago that Clay and I came to Westminster. Our church on the east side of St. Paul closed. This is our 10th anniversary of our closing. Arlington Hills Presbyterian. And so today, as I listen to your remarks about your years here at this church, I'm reminded of the reason we transitioned to this community after our church closed, even though it's a considerable drive for us on the eastern side of the Twin Cities. But when I come to church every Sunday morning and every adult education program I sit in on. More and more, with hearing reports of the declining membership in the Christian Church, Presbyterian Church, I'm listening for words of hope of why churches like this are going to continue to be sustainable. Obviously, campaigns help that, but membership decline erodes that, seems to erode that hope. I would like to hear from you why you're hopeful for the continuance of this church and the Christian church in general throughout the world, when there's so much that's feeding negativity into that hope every day.
This sounds like the last question I often ask a town hall forum speaker after they've described some terrible situation. Are you hopeful? Why? But let me reiterate that the church isn't ours. It's the body of Christ. It's the Spirit at work in a community. And the Spirit will be here whether the church exists in its form as it is or not. And the reason I'm hopeful is that we can trust in that. We can trust that even if we might be a minority community, which is what the church has been for much of its history anyway, the Spirit will still be there. God will be at work among people and among communities like this. God is not giving up on being an incarnate presence on the earth. And frankly, that presence doesn't depend on whether there's a church or not. God is already loose in the world. It's up to us to figure out where God is at work in the world, grab hold to the extent we can of that Spirit, and be a community that aligns with that movement of the Spirit. And you know, there are churches like this that have a better chance of thriving into the future because they can be diverse, because they can have the resources, because they can be visible in the community, which is all the more reason why we need to be reaching out to other communities of faith, to other Christian churches, and partnering up all the time because God works through large churches and small churches. And we have a certain responsibility in that direction. Specific about Westminster, our staff, our lay leaders, people who serve as volunteers in our boards and committees and classrooms are wonderful, committed people. And I have huge trust in their capacity to figure out what the Spirit's going to do with this community next. Yeah, so, Betty.
With that last slide, I thought you were going to tell us about the wonderful efforts you made for gay ordination and for opening up this whole church, for celebrating the gay life in our community. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. When I was called here, you remember back in the 90s, the Presbyterian Church was really struggling over the issue of inclusivity. And the search committee said to me, there are a few issues we want to have front and center with our next minister. There were three things, actually, that they said our new minister is going to have to provide leadership about. One was re-engaging the city. We had turned inward because of the departure of Gordon and Kay and the difficulties. We were really doing a lot of interior work. It was time to turn back out into the city. Second was, we're a downtown church that we think ought to have a strong ministry with children, youth, and families. And we hope our new minister will lead in that direction. And the third was, we'd like a minister who will help us as a congregation and the denomination as a whole across the country figure out how to be a much more inclusive body. So, we did that.
Thank you.
Tim, knowing a little bit about your nature to be a planner, do you mind sharing a little bit about what the first month of retirement is going to look like for you?
Yeah. I'm retiring October 31st. November 2nd, we will get in our packed car, which we'll pack on November 1st, and drive to New Mexico. And I think you could do this when you retire. You can just stay as long as you want. So we'll stay, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks, be back in time for Thanksgiving. So we'll go see Madeline, who's the pastor of Westminster Presbyterian Church in Santa Fe, help her do some projects around her house, and go to Ghost Ranch. There's a board meeting. I'm currently the president of the board there, so we'll be at the ranch for a while and help Madeline for a while, then go back to the ranch and maybe drive over to Taos and go to the hot springs. And yeah, we're going to just relax. That's the first month. And I think I'll have many more months kind of like that. Within 24 hours of my public announcement that I was retiring, I was asked to come do an interim job. And holy cow, I said no. And they called back 2 weeks later, and I said no. The answer is still, if I wanted to stay in a church, I'd stay here. But I don't intend to take on interim ministries. And, I've got 2 boards I'm serving on, the Ghost Ranch and the McCormick Seminary Board. Both boards are involved in searches for their new executive leader. That will keep me engaged intellectually and in the life of the church beyond this place. So Beth and I have plans to travel and do some long walks while we still are able to do that. Going to Ireland, we hope, next spring to walk the Ring of Kerry. And this is one of my problems. I go, think of the sermon illustrations on that wall. I'm serious. I'm always looking for sermon illustrations. I got to get out of that habit. Someone else? Yes?
Betty brought up a question. Okay, do you still have a question, Dan? Sorry. Scott is no? Okay, are we ready? Okay, well, let's give Doug Mitchell the last question over here. Doug.
Uh-oh. Well.
Tim, as the senior pastor, a lot of what you do is very visible to this congregation and to the city and the denomination. But one of the most important aspects of what you've done here is not so visible, which is your commitment to support the other clergy staff who are here. And that is not universal among senior pastors. If you did a poll of associate pastors in the denomination, that is not the answer you would always get. But your willingness to invest in the success of the associates on this staff and to be with them when they need it has been invaluable. And I just want to note that and thank you, and God bless.
Thank you, Doug. Appreciate that. Oh, no. Kathy, Michael. Okay.
Let's see, how much time do we have? Well, I second what Doug has said. Dan Little was an incredible leader when he came to provide transition and support and change for us here. And I learned to claim my own voice when Dan was here. And I thought, when the new person comes, if I can't have my own voice, I can't stay. Well, Tim not only let me have my own voice, but made me a better person. I have told every associate who has come to interview since then that this is a senior pastor who knows how to share power. And as Doug has said, that's a very, very rare thing. And I thank you for that. And also, I thank you for being one of the most fun people I know. I think that's been one of the hard things for me about retirement is not the fun that we have had together. We've laughed and told jokes and made up great scenarios about how to solve problems with ice flows and other things. But we've had a great time together, and I thank you for making me a better person, a more committed person, a happier person, and a very grateful friend. Thank you.
Goodness, thank you, Kathy. Okay, are we going to eat now? Is that the idea?
Not quite. Almost.
Almost, okay.
Keith, can we have the next slide? Tim did a wonderful job. I'm not sure which mic's going, so we'll stick with this one. Want to thank you all for coming and tell you about our upcoming programs. We've got next month on the 11th, Music and Health with Andrea Leap. She's back by popular demand. This time she's going to discuss our body's biochemical responses when we hear, play, or sing music, from strengthening our memories to calming our hearts. And then November 1st, it is the 1st. This is a different week for us in November. But we've got Reverend Dr. Fran Shelton, who is senior pastor, or retired senior I'm getting it all wrong. A retired associate pastor, pastoral care pastor from several congregations in Texas, Presbyterian congregations. She's going to explore giving voice to feelings and experiences in grief and pondering open-ended questions as we learn how sorrow prompts untapped courage and wisdom. And Margaret, will you say a prayer before we eat?
Let's thank Tim again for being here with us today. Thank you, Tim. And now let's give thanks to God. Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, we thank you for your church. We thank you for your grace in our lives and in the world and the call to witness to that grace. We thank you for Tim and for his service here. We thank you for all the baptized in our midst. We pray, God, that you would sustain and nurture this place and your church the world over. We give you thanks for the food that is before us, for those who have prepared it and brought it here, and for the opportunity to continue in conversation and sharing together. In Jesus' name, amen.